Wel, croeso chi gyd y sesiwn yma. Fydd Ben Kelly yn trafod agweddau ar neithio'r llefrifol a'r Green New Deal, y ddel y fath werdd yma. Neu i'r rhysgol yn adran geiryddiaeth, a fi sy'n mynd yn cadeirio'r sesiwn heddi. A gael ei gyflwyno yn y cychwyn fan hyn, mae Ben yn ei fod staff yn y adran y Gymraeg ac y Swyddfa Celtedd, hynny o Iwerddon, o orllewin Iwerddon wedi studio Prifysgol Iwerddon yn Galway ar gyfer ei ran israddedig a'i MA. Wedyn ni'n mynd i Gaeredin i astudio gyfer ei felthuriaeth. A doedd ffyrniaeth yn canolbwyntio ar y gweddau o adnewyddu iaith, hwyddo ieithoedd lleafrifol. A beth mae'n drafod heddiw ni'n credu yn mynd i fod yn fath o bwysles newydd yn credu, sy'n mynd datblygu dros y blynyddoedd nesaf, canolbwyntio ar y berthynas rhwng ieithoedd lleafrifol a hefyd wedyn ni falle gweddau mwy amgylcheddol fan hyn a'r ymges i fyw mewn ffyrdd mwy gwyrdd os ych chi moyn, a hyn yn asiodd gwrs gyda beth ni wedi bod yn trafod yn ystod yr wyl yr wythnos hon. O ran trefen, gobeithio bod chi gyd yn deall Gymraeg, sori, mae'n rhy hwyr nawr. Ond fe fydd na gyfle chi holi cwestiynau. Mae Ben yn ei siarad yn Saesneg, a fydd na gwestiynau chi holi, cyfle i holi cwestiwn un yn y Gymraeg i'r Saesneg ar y diwedd. Mae Ben yn hapus i dderbyn cwestiynau fel bynnag iaith yna. A ti'n ei siarad yn rhyw hanner awr yma?
Tua hanner awr.
Tua hanner awr, wedi ni gen i gyfle i'r cwestiynau ar ôl. So, diolch yn fawr i ti, Ben.
Diolch.
A diolch yn fawr i ti weid.
Greit, diolch i chi i gyd am ddod. Yn anffodus, dwi ddim yn eitha dda yn siarad y Gymraeg eto i drafod ponciau academaidd, felly bydd i'n siarad yn Saesneg, ond fel dwelodd Rhys, dwi'n fodlon iawn siarad gyda chi yn Gymraeg ar ôl i fi gorffen y papur. You're all very welcome. Thanks for coming. I noticed that in some of the advertising for this, the question mark was deleted from the title, and I don't know quite how that happened because it's very much intended to be there. Far from making any sort of definitive statement about this matter, really this is sort of a provocation, me thinking out loud to a certain degree and inviting, in the spirit of academic curiosity, your feedback. So, especially with COP26 coming up so soon, it seemed appropriate for me to talk about this, which has kind of been in the back of my mind for a while. As Rhys said, my PhD was about neoliberalism and its negative effects on Irish-speaking communities and Irish language policy. And this talk today, I suppose, is an attempt by me to move away from that very, very depressing research to something at least somewhat a little bit more hopeful, I think. I've been teaching here for about a year, teaching Gaelic languages and language revitalisation now and so on. And I'm generally interested in, I suppose, the sociology of language and the political economy, as we might call it, of language policy. Which is to say, I don't study political ecology. I don't have any particular expertise in that field, despite being interested in it on a casual basis and being, I suppose, a long-standing supporter of environmental direct action groups. My academic speciality is very much on the language side of this talk. So for people who know more about political ecology and the Green New Deal, if you have comments to make, I'd very much like to hear them. So before I explain exactly what the Green New Deal is, just a very brief recap of why exactly it's needed. Most of you will probably know this already, but the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, launched its most recent report in August, which was called Code Red for Humanity by the head of the United Nations, the General Secretary. For what's generally regarded, I think, as quite a conservative body, it's hard to imagine the IPCC having put things in stronger terms than they did in their recent report. situation is quite severe in that under all of the projected models that they proposed based on various likely political courses of action, we're likely to go over 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels by 2040, and that will then involve in turn what they said, quote, were unprecedented in the historical record extreme weather events. The problem is we're currently not on track to stay anywhere near 1.5 degrees. There was something in the BBC yesterday about how in the next 10 years, the amount of fossil fuels that will be extracted will be double the amount that would be required to stay under 1.5. People often think this just means rising seas, but of course really that's only a small part of the problem. You can always, in theory, move away from the coast. It's much harder to do anything about, mass crop failure or socio-political instability brought about by ecological disruption or, disastrous flooding or fires or whatnot. And of course, it's not just a climate crisis that we face, but a much wider ecological one. It's often said that we live in the era of the sixth mass extinction, with the fifth one having occurred 65 million years ago when an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. I'll stop there before I go any further with the doom, because it's very easy to get carried away with it. There's lots of other statistics we'll all be somewhat familiar with, I'm sure. But the point I'm making is that something clearly needs to happen, right? So then enter the Green New Deal. What do I mean by this? Well, it's a contested term and it's mobilized differently by different political actors in different countries, different territories, from different positions on the political spectrum. But I suppose the general idea is that it draws on the original New Deal, which was implemented in the US in the early 1930s in response to the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it. And it is, I suppose, an attempt to remake society and the economy in a way that gives us some chance of having an ecologically sustainable future. A classic trope of the Green New Deal is that we should, instead of worrying about all the jobs that are likely to be lost through decarbonisation, we should instead focus on how we can create employment that is sustainable, doing things like, say, retrofitting buildings in terms of insulation and whatnot, to make them more ecologically sustainable, developing better public transport, reforming the way food is produced and distributed is another big one you often hear mentioned. And all of this kind of comes under the umbrella of a just transition, as they call it. So the idea being that decarbonising the economy shouldn't result in, the plunging of even greater sections of the population into further penury or precarity or whatnot. Now, personally, I've often worried, I suppose, that the Green New Deal is really just a management strategy for capitalism that, throws a few crumbs from the table to the working class of the liberal democratic West, installs a few solar panels that are made by, what are effectively slaves in sweatshops with minerals plundered from Africa and so on, but doesn't really do anything to challenge the fundamental dynamics of an economic system based on infinite growth on a finite planet and so on. By coincidence, I bumped into Anne Pettiford, who wrote this book here. She's an economist, writes quite a lot about, I suppose, political and economic ecology. I bumped into her, was actually while blockading the Bank of England in London in 2019, and I got talking to her about this point. I remember charging her with necro-Keynesianism, so this idea of re-establishing or invigorating Keynesianism, the economic model that kind of dominated between 1945 and the early 1970s before neoliberalism emerged as an economic hegemony. And she was, very adamant that in her conception, anyway, of the Green New Deal, the point was to use this as a stepping stone to move towards something that would ultimately be, I suppose, post-capitalist. Now, I suppose that may well just have been what she thought I wanted to hear. I don't entirely know, but it made me curious enough that I did some more reading in the intervening years about the Green New Deal and different conceptions of it, and I'll quote some of those in a little bit. But I do suppose it reminds me of something I read when I was a undergrad studying politics, and I remember doing a course on political upheavals and the sort of the factors that drive them. And there was a quote that's always stood with me from de Tocqueville, and he said, "The most perilous moment for a bad government is one when it seeks to mend its ways." And I guess the idea here is that when people realize that things can be better, then they go on to demand more, expectations increase, and so on. I've often wondered in the last, decade really now since I did that course, about how contemporary scholarship sees that. And I haven't really been able to find a good answer. So if anyone has a comment on that quote later on, I'd very much like to hear it. But I do suppose it chimes with what Pettifor is saying about the Green New Deal potentially opening the door for something that ultimately would be more radical than the sort of relatively moderate social democratic proposal it tends to be at the moment. So that's an extremely brief summary of the Green New Deal. Now, to say something I know a little bit more about anyway, regarding language endangerment and that sort of theme of the talk. Again, very quick summary for those that don't know. By the best estimate we have, there's about 7,000 languages spoken in the world today versus roughly 200 nation states. But on average, one of these dies out every 10 days, each one being the equivalent of a national library being burned down, as the kind of the cliche goes. Globally, linguistic diversity tends to be located in areas of high ecological diversity. And a classic example here, I guess, is Papua New Guinea, home to vast tracts of relatively unspoiled rainforest, but also where over 850 languages are spoken. This co-location is sometimes referred to by the phrase biocultural diversity. And it's often observed that such linguistic minorities often are sort of, I suppose, the keepers of what is termed traditional ecological knowledge, much of which allows for the maintenance of biodiversity, in a way that otherwise tends not to happen. Obviously, in theory, there's nothing stopping that knowledge being translated, right? We can always translate from one language to another. But the point is that doesn't tend to happen because the same processes which drive language shift in these communities also contribute to the destruction generally of the socioeconomic basis of these communities and destroys them as communities as well as losing their language and culture. There's also been some very interesting research done about the effects of language shift on the mental health of populations, particularly from First Nations groups in Canada. And I suppose this speaks to the fact that language, as well as obviously being for communication, also performs a key role of identity construction and group cohesion. And then when this breaks down, it has negative effects on the mental well-being of a population. I've just been listening to a very interesting podcast about more or less that exact topic. Some of you might be interested in. It's called Landed, and it's part of a series called Farmerama, which is about agroecology and permaculture, I suppose, generally. But they have this Landed sort of mini-series is about crofting, so small-scale farming in the west of Scotland, traditionally Gaelic-speaking areas, and talks an awful lot in a sort of an engaging manner about this concept of biocultural diversity and ecological sustainability. So some of you might be interested in checking that out. And of course, it's also well known that ecological collapse tends to impact minoritized groups first and worst. So there's interesting research about Irish-speaking areas being some of the most predisposed to increasing sea levels in the coming years that are predicted. I guess ultimately, I think that diversity is a good thing, and that all of us lose when we lose languages. And this is why I guess I have this interest in language revitalisation, the attempt to reverse this process. So key point about that work then, to understand what I'm going to argue here today, is that people often assume that language revitalisation is about immersion schooling, it's about classes for adults, it's about these sort of linguistic, fairly linguicentric fixes to the problem. And sure, these things have their role. I'd be the first to say that. But I would also say that their role is much more limited than people tend to assume. Rather, language revitalisation at its best is actually about sustaining communities and giving communities the resources and the power over to determine their own fate, really. So Colin Williams, emeritus professor in Cardiff, some of you will know, I'm sure, he's put it like this. It's an important quote: "Political autonomy and economic autarky are the twin preconditions of successful language regeneration." So autarky, in case anyone doesn't know, I didn't know before this quote, is just basically a synonym for autonomy. Here are some similar points being made by other sort of heavy hitters in the field of language revitalisation. Bernard Spolsky saying that it's really social policy that we need, not language policy, because it's change in society that affects linguistic diversity, not anything to do with the language per se. And then Suzanne Romain, another important scholar in the field, talking about how really arguments in favour of reversing language shift are about sustaining viable communities. Joshua Fishman, definitely the most important scholar in the field of language revitalisation, is well known for making similar comments himself. That's, of course, as I say, not to imply that linguicentric solutions, language policy isn't needed, but that if you don't address things like, say, the ability of Airbnb to destroy the housing market in Welsh-speaking communities, you'll always be on the back foot, right, when you're trying to maintain linguistic diversity. Some of you might be aware at the moment in Scotland, and similarly in Ireland, actually, there are political campaigns to try and increase or establish institutions, I suppose, that would grant political autonomy to a greater degree over Irish and Gaelic-speaking areas for just these reasons. So I also want to note here that another important scholar in my field, John Edwards, has often pointed out that people who want to revitalise languages very typically want to just change the language spoken in a community, in a society, but basically keep the socioeconomic status quo the way it is. And then he makes the point that, well, of course, generally, it is that very socioeconomic status quo that has led to language X being minoritized in the first place. His next move then tends to be to say something like, well, of course, revolutions can happen, but no one wants that, right? Now, I think that there are enough challenges, crises, ecological but also other, and enough anti-systemic sentiment bubbling all over the world, really, that Edwards' sort of out-of-hand dismissal of the potential for revolutionary upheaval is maybe premature in an era of ever-escalating ecological collapse. So I'll talk about that a little bit now. Naomi Klein, who some of you might know, has written also a great deal about the Green New Deal as a concept and a sort of as a political campaigner as well as a commentator. She's been involved. I apologise for this wall of text, but it's important for the argument that I'm making, so I'm going to quote it in full. So she says, "We need more than a New Deal painted green or a Marshall Plan with solar panels. We need changes of a different quality and character. We need wind and solar power that is distributed and, where possible, community-owned, rather than the New Deal's highly centralised, monopolistic, river-damming hydro and fossil fuel power. We need beautifully designed, racially integrated, zero-carbon urban housing, built with democratic input from communities of colour, rather than the sprawling white suburbs and racially segregated urban housing projects of the post-war period. We need to devolve power and resources to indigenous communities," so key point, "smallholder farmers, ranchers and sustainable fishing folks, so they can lead a process of planting billions of trees, rehabilitating wetlands and renewing soil, rather than handing over control of conservation to the military and federal agencies, as was overwhelmingly the case in the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps." So that's from her work On Fire, which was published last year. And of course, this is fairly polemical rhetoric, right? But hopefully, the connection between this and Colin Williams talking about political autonomy and economic autarky as the twin preconditions of language revitalisation are clear to you. And I guess really that's the crux of my argument right here. On the one hand, we have very highly regarded figures in my field, language revitalisation, talking about the sort of things we need to do that most effectively. And on the other hand, we have significant international political discourse at the moment about a Green New Deal, some conceptions of which at least propose to do basically that. So maybe the Green New Deal is just what communities in the west of Ireland or the northwest of Scotland that I'm most familiar with, maybe that's exactly what they need serendipitously. Wouldn't that be great? Now, of course, just because Naomi Klein writes that doesn't mean that that's how it's understood widely by everyone or even by most political actors, or by any means that that's what we will get. Many of you will know Labour have made sort of various noises about their proposals in terms of decarbonising the economy that go at least a little bit further than the Tories' recent announcement. But at the same time, I don't imagine Starmer will be signing up wholesale for the sort of vision that Naomi Klein is putting forward there. Not least considering he blocked the sort of the momentum proposal in the recent Labour Party conference, and there was all that hoo-ha about it. Generally, I think there's much too much attention paid to what happens within the Labour Party and indeed all political parties. I only mention that because it's sort of a contemporary and relevant example that highlights, I guess, how sort of radical interpretations of the Green New Deal will likely be resisted if they gain further political traction. But nonetheless, I think it's significant that ideas like Klein's are being talked about as widely as they are. And ideas like hers and others like her, Noam Chomsky's said similar things, Pettifor, who I mentioned earlier on, lots of others too, they do clearly animate significant amounts of people all over the world. Groups obviously like Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, who've been blocking the M25 recently, the Sunrise Movement in America, Green New Deal Rising, all these groups in different places all over the world have sort of broadly similar understanding of the solutions that they propose as to Klein. So worth paying, I think, at least some heed to. There we go. Now, another major caveat, I am not a historian, so take all this next bit with a pinch of salt. But from what I understand of it, there are a few lessons we can learn from the original New Deal about how a Green New Deal could both be achieved and then also how it might be received. So as I mentioned earlier on, this of course was originally implemented in the wake of the Wall Street crash of 1929 under the Roosevelt administration in the US. And it was, I suppose, a wide-scale program of public investment, job creation, and so on that aimed to save much of at least the white working class from destitution. And while Roosevelt himself tends to get a lot of credit for this, I think it's important to understand that this only ever really happened because of the power of trade unions at the time to force the hand of the political administration to implement such reforms. Fred Bloch, sort of a classic writer of the New Left era, wrote a famous article called "The Ruling Class Does Not Rule" about the nature, I suppose, of political policy and class power under capitalism. And he makes the point in that article that as well as the power of the trade unions, the other key factor which allowed the New Deal, such as it was, to be implemented was that there was an international economic crisis happening at the time. And this is because generally, say a radical reforming government gets into power and has great ambitions to redistribute power and wealth to the benefit of the working class. Capital can always use, and does always use, the threat of divestment, capital flight as a way to defang such proposals. So they say, if you go ahead with this New Deal you're talking about, we will just up sticks and move to wherever. And then politicians worry about the economic cost that this would entail, the jobs that would be lost, how unpopular all of that would be, and so they concede. And I suppose if we think of a government like Syriza, say in Greece in 2015, it was a slightly different dynamic, because much of the pressure, I suppose, was coming from the European Central Bank and the IMF, as much as the Greek capitalist class. But obviously they were elected on a radical proposal of we'll defy austerity and so on and so forth, and ultimately wound up capitulating entirely and implementing exactly what they had sworn, and organised the referendum and all of that to oppose. So I guess this is important when we talk about the New Deal, because when the Roosevelt administration implemented these policies, there weren't a whole lot of options of economies which were more favourable to business at the time, say with lower tax rates or so on, with to which they could move. The international nature of the economic crisis meant that they kind of had to put up with it, because the US was still the most favourable option they had available to themselves. So they sort of reluctantly conceded, even though it involved, massive tax increases for the richest in the US at the time. Now, I'll come back to that point in a moment, because I say mostly conceded. There's more to be said about that. I think that all of this point is relevant, though, because obviously at the moment we're living through, an international economic disruption which has been brought about by COVID, and there's been lots of talk about, how we build back better and so on, and remains to be seen what will come of that, and it also remains to be seen how severe the disruption will be in economic terms over the sort of long term. But I think there's maybe some analogy to be made there, nonetheless. The other element required, of course, in addition to an international economic disruption, is organised labour, and 40 years of neoliberalism have clearly taken their toll on that, right? But again, I think there's, a large degree of, as they say, anti-systemic sentiment present all over the world at the moment, from Hong Kong in recent years, Paris, Black Lives Matter riots and so on. So I don't think it's, at least on a good day, I don't think it's utterly impossible to foresee, sort of a crystallization of these forces and further trade union militancy as things escalate in ecological and political terms in coming years. I think faced with such a coalition of sort of ecological and labour activists and so on, it could occur that the political class might see a Green New Deal as the least worst option that faces them, and will sort of offer some concessions in the way we got, the 8-hour day or weekends or whatever, despite initial resistance from the capitalist class. Now, major word of caution that I want to offer here, and which I haven't seen discussed anywhere in other work about the Green New Deal, is that while I said it was broadly accepted, the New Deal in the 30s, there was also a kind of forgotten attempt by sections of the capitalist class in the US to organise a fascist coup in response to the New Deal. This is sometimes called the business plot or the Wall Street putsch, and it involved people like J.P. Morgan Jr., DuPont, the CEOs of General Motors, Birdseye, and General Foods, amongst others. And they contacted a retired general, whose name was Smedley Butler, I think. Yeah, Smedley D. Butler, who they wanted to install as a dictator. And they sent people to Europe to learn from Mussolini. The French fascists were extremely strong at the time, and were kind of the model they wanted to follow, as far as I understand. And it was a fairly well developed plot. They had an immense amount of power and resources behind them. This general, Butler, actually snitched on them to Congress, and that's how the whole thing came to light. There was a congressional hearing. Interestingly, even now, many of the names of the people who were involved in this are still redacted. So the people, on the organising side of this attempted coup. So I think that this should offer us caution, remind us of the fact that very often in times of intense conflict in the political and economic sphere, the far right can be extremely useful to capital. And also, that all revolutions have to face counter-revolutions by the forces of reaction and so on. And I think a Green New Deal, whatever form that might take, would likely experience similar difficulties. Obviously, eco-fascism is a kind of a beast in and of itself, and so far its presence in the real world has only been, has been fairly limited to stochastic terrorism, which has been horrendously brutal, things like, the Christchurch mosques attacks and so on. But it isn't, a mass force in the way, Extinction Rebellion is in society. However, I think we have to always be aware of the fact that that could change as things progress. And it might emerge in the sort of 21st century equivalent of the business plot, or any other number of forms it could take as well. So that sober note of caution aside, I guess what I'm arguing here is overall an optimistic point about how a Green New Deal may yet become politically viable, and how this could have serendipitous positive consequences for marginalised communities, including linguistic ones. Of course, this isn't predetermined, and there are plenty of paths to barbarism open to us unless popular struggle closes them off. And of course, nothing is gained without struggle. I really, personally anyway, don't think that the elites will bestow anything positive on us unless they're forced to do so. And without people being willing to build power from below in terms of, as I say, unions, but also direct action groups focusing on the environment per se. And I think the lessons of the New Deal that I've talked about kind of back up this analysis. I'm painfully aware, however, of the various systemic forces which make such mobilization difficult, and I wrote about that somewhat in my PhD in terms of like resisting austerity and so on. But as I say, on a good day, I can see the potential for that to occur, and I think also things like the Tories' new police and crime bill and all of the extant political legislation against trade unions and so on means that they can too, or at least that they worry about the potential for anti-systemic forces to gain more traction. For people who value linguistic diversity, the extent to which it's being lost is of course, an upsetting fact. But in light of the sort of existential nature of the ecological situation we're in, language loss and revitalisation will come to be seen as a hopelessly peripheral endeavour, unless it's understood as inherently connected to these sort of wider struggles for reforming society and the economy, which I think that is the way people like Colin Williams and Suzanne Romain and so on, who I quoted earlier on, would argue is the way we should approach language revitalisation anyway. But it seems certain at this stage that ecological destruction will soon begin to affect all of us who it hasn't affected already. Of course, some a lot worse than others. But I think that if significant organisational efforts are made, that there's still the potential to wrench positive change from the hands of the powerful. So if you're not already in a union, join in and be active in it. For those of us who are in UCU, make sure you vote to strike in the current ballot. With that bit of soapboxing out of the way, I'll just conclude by saying, as I said at the outset, I don't study political ecology in any concerted way, so I'm very aware that there are likely huge blind spots in what I've just presented. But looking at things as objectively as I can, I think radical change is clearly needed, and if that takes the form that people like Naomi Klein and others argue for, it might provide the redistribution of resources and power that could be of great use to the many beleaguered linguistic minorities around the world who are at such risk at the moment. So time will tell. Diolch yn fawr.